first speaker, Dr. Thompson.
Well, thank you very much. Well, today I was planning to say a few words about the relationship between consciousness and matter, and I want to give a report on some investigations I've done recently in connection with the quantum theory, and show how this ties in with Vedic philosophy. So I'll begin by saying a few words about consciousness. This actually is an illustration in my book, if you can't see the projection here. One may ask, what is the nature of the relationship between states of consciousness and material systems? In modern science, of course, the idea has been very widely disseminated that consciousness is a product of the action of the brain. Generally, people think in terms of a computer model in which various interactions involving nerve impulses and so forth generate the functions of the mind. However, it has also been observed that there is such a thing as consciousness in and of itself. This is, of course, a whole subject of discussion in philosophy, known basically as the mind-body problem. And, of course, many volumes have been written on this subject. So I'm not going to try and review the discussions of the mind-body problem here, but I wanted to make a brief observation concerning the kind of relationship that must exist between consciousness and physical states of the brain if we accept consciousness as an actually existing reality. So the basic point here is that in analyzing the brain, one can look at it in terms of a hierarchy of levels of abstraction. At the lowest level, as shown in this chart, you have the brain hardware. This is indicated here by some drawings of nerve cells. So within this brain hardware, elementary physical events occur, which supposedly should add up to generate all the different phenomena that are produced by the brain. For example, nerve impulses can travel along different axons and dendrites of the neurons, and at synapses, different chemical reactions can take place, and so on. So these are basic neural operations. So to try and understand how the brain could represent the mind, the general approach which is used is to organize conceptually basic operations into larger units which can be referred to by symbols in a higher order language of some kind. Now, of course, this hasn't really been done yet for the brain, but this is the approach that people use when they deal with computers. For example, I'll just show an illustration here from a book on artificial intelligence. This is probably quite small, but in this series of levels here, the lowest one says transistors, as in an old-fashioned transistorized computer. And then come the level of flip-flops and gates. Now, flip-flops and gates are actually combinations of transistors, so that represents a level of abstraction above the transistor level. Then you come to registers and data paths, machine instructions. This is the level of machine language. Compiler or interpreter, and then Lisp, that's a kind of programming language. So at the level, say, of Lisp, you will have statements in a language, but they refer to complicated combinations of the lower order entities in this hierarchy. And ultimately they refer to actual physical processes in the machine. And finally, according to this artificial intelligence scheme, you get up to intelligent programs at the top. Of course, this hasn't really been realized yet. But that's the idea of how one could represent mind in terms of the operation of a machine. So going back to this picture, let us suppose you could do this for the brain. Then, at a lower level, you'd have basic neural operations, and you could work your way up some kind of hierarchy until, at the upper level, you would have things corresponding to thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and so forth. So if we regard consciousness as being actually something that really exists, that is, we have states of consciousness. For example, I'm now perceiving the people here in this room, and also perceiving what I'm feeling, and so on. So the question comes, what is the relationship between the consciousness and the material system? So one can say that whatever the nature of that relationship is, it can only be a direct relationship between the states of consciousness, thoughts, feelings, and so on, and the higher order patterns within this material system. There's no direct one-to-one correlation between the states of consciousness and, say, nerve impulses. So this leads to the idea that the relation between states of consciousness and the material system is in some way what the physicists would call non-local. So I'll mention briefly what this concept is. In physics, there is the idea that material entities can either interact with one another in their immediate vicinity, that is, with no spatial separation, or they might interact with one another across a distance. Of course, when Newton introduced his law of gravitation, it was very controversial because he was proposing that gravitational force acts instantly over a large distance. So that's an example of a non-local interaction. An example of a local interaction would be given by, say, the laws of electromagnetism. If you have an electric and a magnetic field, then according to Maxwell's equations, at each point they're interacting with each other with no spatial separation. So in present-day physics, the basic idea is that all interactions should be understood as local interactions. This is actually required by the Einstein special theory of relativity, for example. And so physicists are very uncomfortable about non-local interactions. So, in particular, of course, a local theory of gravitation was introduced by Einstein. That's his general theory of relativity. So the point I wanted to introduce here about consciousness is that if you accept consciousness as something real, it seems to interact with matter in a non-local fashion. And so I'm going to return to that point later on in the discussion. Now, before going further with consciousness, I want to introduce another basic theme which I would like to discuss, and that is the theme of biological complexity. So here we have a diagram of mechanical arrangements within the bodies. For example, the eye has many highly complicated systems. I was told by one medical student that I knew that there's a certain membrane in here called Decimet's membrane. It's just one little layer of cells, and somebody wrote a 300-page doctoral dissertation just on that. So, actually, these biological structures can be highly complex, and the question is, how do such structures originate? So, of course, this has been a subject of much discussion, and the basic idea of how they originate, which has been adopted by modern-day science, is the Darwinian theory of evolution and the various forms of that. So it is a fact, however, that this theory has not provided explicit explanations of how highly complex forms come into being. Actually, all of the examples in which one can give a plausible explanation of how biological form comes into being through an evolutionary process involve very simple aspects of biological form. Of course, one can say that complex form is difficult to deal with simply because it's complex, and indeed that is true. But it remains a fact that it is somewhat of a mystery still at the present time how these complex forms come into being. This is another interesting example right here. It seems that there are certain butterflies which have iridescent wings. And if you magnify the wings, you'll see they're made of little scales like shingles of a roof. And if you magnify them further, you'll find that there are very tiny diffraction gratings mounted on raised platforms along the lengths of these scales. So somehow or other, nature has created diffraction gratings there. So one may wonder just how this comes about. Some indication of what is involved in the origin of biological form is given by the study of biological form on the molecular level. For example, this is a structural diagram of a transfer RNA molecule. It's one of the molecules that exists within living cells. And it's a very complex and precisely constructed molecule. And in fact, on the molecular level, within cells, one finds a very high level of complexity. Here is an example of a bacteriophage. This is a simple diagram of a kind of virus that infects bacteria. And I can show briefly here how the bacteriophage works. This is interesting because it's an example of a fairly simple biological system. In fact, one of the simplest in existence. This device consists of a hollow shell containing the DNA of the bacteriophage and a kind of syringe mechanism. What happens here is that the bacteriophage will come in contact with the wall of a bacterium, and it recognizes the surface as being that of the right kind of bacterium. And then the spring-like arrangement contracts and drives this hollow syringe through the wall of the bacterium. And then the DNA, which is coiled up inside this capsule, goes through the tube into the bacterium. And once that happens, the bacterium begins to follow the instructions in the viral DNA, and it begins to manufacture viruses through a process of assembly of different parts. So, just for the fun of it, here is an example of a very simple simulation of such a process. This is a very super simplified bacteriophage. We have rectangles with bond sites, and these represent molecules, protein molecules, which can bond together according to certain rules. And these are so designed that once they are allowed to move about at random, they can actually bond together to form a completed structure like this. So the process of this bonding together is shown here in a computer simulation. This is a time sequence in which you start out with a random arrangement of these molecules, and gradually they begin to assemble together to form a completed structure by engaging in a random walk process. So this is a simulation of this on a very simple level of what's going on with this bacteriophage. But the interesting point to make about this is that you can ask, what happens if you vary the parameters which are involved in specifying these different bond values and the different distances and so forth? What you find is that there are only certain combinations of the parameters which will produce a system that works and assembles itself. Most combinations do not do so. And in fact, just varying two of the parameters, we find a situation like this, in which, in this particular graph, two parameters are plotted on the horizontal axes here, and the vertical axis represents the degree of effectiveness with which the system functions and assembles together. And one can see that you have a series of peaks that tend to be separated from one another. This turns out to be a general property of such systems. There will be many different parameters, and only for certain very precisely specified combinations will the system function properly. If you vary them very slightly, then the system ceases to function properly. So you can imagine a multidimensional space with many different parameters representing all the different properties of the system. And there'll be many isolated islands or peaks within that space representing viable systems, and a very large volume of space representing systems that don't work. So the question is, by what process do you manage to find your way to a peak representing, or an island representing a viable form? By a evolutionary optimization process, once you're on a given peak, you can climb up to the top, moving in the immediate vicinity. But the question is, how do you get to such a peak? So this is a general question in biology. So, of course, what I wanted to discuss was some alternative ideas to the standard explanation of how this comes about. So one example of such an idea is the theory propounded by a man named Walter Elsasser at Johns Hopkins University. This Walter Elsasser was a physicist who later turned to biology. And so he proposed a rather interesting theory as to how complicated organic form could come into being. And this theory is based on some of the unique features of the quantum theory. Briefly, the nature of the quantum theory is that it does not determine exactly what is going to happen in a physical system. You're no doubt familiar with quantum phenomena such as radioactive decay, in which the particular time at which a radioactive atom, say, emits an alpha particle, is not determined by any physical law. It's a completely random event. Well, random events, as treated by quantum mechanics, can be dealt with statistically as long as the probabilities for these events are fairly high. For example, if you have something with a probability of 1 out of 1,000, then if you repeat the circumstances in which that event can arise several thousand times, and the event happens several times, then you have evidence that it's happening with a probability of about 1 out of 1,000. If you could only repeat it 100 times and say it occurred once, then you'd have no basis for saying that it had a probability of 1 out of 1,000. So to talk about probabilities of events, you need to have repetitions commensurate with the reciprocal of the probability, that is, 1 divided by the probability. So in quantum mechanics, it turns out that probabilities or possibilities are there for very large numbers of distinct events, so that these have nearly equal probability. The numbers can be so large that they're what Elsasser called immense. He used the term immense to refer to any number larger than about 10 to the 100th power. So if you have a situation in which there are more than 10 to the 100th power alternatives, and one of them comes up, then you cannot say that that is happening by chance, because it's impossible to reproduce the situation enough times to measure such probabilities. So Elsasser used this idea as a means of introducing new laws into physics, which are compatible with the laws of quantum mechanics, which are independent of those laws. Actually, Elsasser proposed that the laws of quantum mechanics as they stand are quite correct. But he said, though, that one could have additional laws. So this was his basic idea. And he referred to these laws by the term that he called creative selection. That is, he said, there can be a process in nature which simply selects highly complex forms. This process does not depend on the laws of physics. It cannot be deduced from them, but also it does not contradict them. It is an independent aspect of nature or of reality, which you can add to the existing framework of quantum mechanics. So I would like to say a little bit about quantum mechanics, because what I'm going to do is elaborate a little bit on Elsasser's idea and show that how that ties in with a number of other interesting ideas. So first, I'll introduce the idea of the quantum mechanical wave function. In quantum mechanics, one does not specify exact positions and velocities of particles. One specifies something called a wave function, which is spread out in space. So if here we have a particle, in quantum mechanics it can be spread out. Now, this spreading is a rather interesting phenomenon. If it occurs just on an atomic or microscopic level, there's no problem. But it is possible for this spreading to occur on a macroscopic level. This is exemplified by the famous Schrödinger cat paradox. This is perhaps the basic example of this. In this paradox, well, it's called a paradox, you have some radioactive atoms, a Geiger counter, and then some apparatus which will kill a cat which is within a box if a radioactive atom decays within a certain time period. And on the other hand, if the atom doesn't decay within that time period, then the cat is not killed. So, according to quantum mechanics, the state of the radioactive atom is actually indeterminate. It's described by a wave function like this, which spreads out not over position exactly, but over the state of the atom being decayed or not decayed. So, the state of the atom can be partly decayed and partly not decayed. The wave function can represent both alternatives at once. So, what happens then is if such an atom is interacting with a Geiger counter, then according to quantum mechanics, you come to a state of affairs in which the Geiger counter is triggered and not triggered. It's a superposition of two states of affairs, one in which the Geiger counter is triggered and one in which it is not. And if the Geiger counter is linked up to this apparatus affecting the cat, then you wind up with a state of affairs in which the cat has been killed and not killed. That is, it's a superposition of two states, one representing a live cat or one representing a dead cat. So this seemed to be a somewhat strange state of affairs. You can ask, well, what happens if you look at the cat? According to the mathematics of the quantum theory, what happens there is that you wind up with an observer who's in many states. He becomes a superposition of an observer seeing a live cat and an observer seeing a dead cat. This is a little diagram that sort of represents the state of the observer. He's not looking at a machine that kills cats in this case, but it's a Wilson cloud chamber that he's supposedly looking at. But a similar thing can happen there. The point is that as far as the theory goes, the observer becomes a superposition of many different observers with different experiences. So this is what is actually predicted by the mathematics of the quantum theory. And so one can ask, well, what does that mean? It seems to be a somewhat strange state of affairs. So over the years, people have had many different approaches to dealing with this. I'll just indicate a few of them. One of these is to, actually this is the Copenhagen interpretation of Niels Bohr. According to this, you divide reality into classical and quantum realms, and you restrict quantum mechanics to microscopic entities like atoms. And you use classical physics for macroscopic entities. And at a certain point, you just switch over from one theory to the next. You do that at the point when you make a measurement with some macroscopic instrument. So this works operationally, but it seems to have this dichotomy between two completely different ways of describing nature. So it doesn't seem to provide a unified picture of what is there. Another one is the theory that consciousness collapses the wave function. This is an idea developed by, well, first von Neumann discussed this, and then Eugene Wigner introduced this idea. So, according to this idea, as soon as an observer becomes conscious of a certain state of affairs, that is, let's say if you have a human observer looking at the cat, as soon as the human observer looks and sees that the cat is living, let us say, then you take all these different alternatives, like the alternative of the live cat and the alternative of the dead cat, and erase all of them but one. And you do that at random, according to the probabilities generated by quantum mechanics. So that is one concept. This leads to the idea that consciousness is affecting the states of of matter in nature. Another idea is that there exist many coexisting parallel universes. According to this scheme, you accept all the different alternatives as being real. And you just say that, in effect, the universe is constantly splitting into many universes in which all the different alternative possibilities actually take place. So in one universe, there's a live cat and an observer seeing a live cat. And in another universe, there's a dead cat and an observer seeing a dead cat, and so forth. So, of course, this leads to some very amazing considerations, because it turns out that this process of splitting the universes continuously goes on, according to the quantum theory. So, let's see. Actually, this is a very controversial area, and I can hardly even begin to discuss all the different points. But the basic idea here is that in quantum mechanics, the basic physical or the basic mathematical description of physical reality tends to spread out in a higher dimensional space and represent many different mutually contradictory states of affairs. It can also represent many different combinations of events. Here's a simple example. Suppose you let decay of radioactive atoms control the typing out of letters by a computer, so that they're typed at random according to the decay of those atoms. And let us say you let it type out 100 letters, and there are 26 letters in your alphabet. And let us say you choose it so the probability for any one letter should be the same. Well, in that case, for the 100 letters, there are 10 to the 26 power possibilities. So the wave function split, as it were, into 26 to the 100th power. 26 to the 100th power, different branches, each one of which represents a different alternative. So this is where Elsasser's idea came in, because he was saying that you can have a law in nature which makes a selection of one of these 10 to the 26th power alternatives. That law is independent of the laws of quantum mechanics, because you cannot in any way measure a probability as small as 1 over 10 to the 26th power. And thus, new principles, independent of quantum mechanics but not contradictory to it, can be introduced. This was his idea. Now, as far as it goes, that is interesting. What I wanted to discuss was some further developments that one can arrive at by examining this idea a little bit further. The best way to approach these ideas is to consider a simple example from classical physics. This is a potential well that is in two dimensions. These contours represent lines of equal potential, and the lowest point is in the center. So you can imagine here a sort of triangular basin. And you can imagine taking a ball bearing and having it roll within this triangular basin, which acts as a force field. Or you can imagine a magnetic field, which has just these lines of equal potential. So it turns out that a simple classical system like this generates something that is called deterministic chaos, which is something that's been studied quite a bit recently. The idea there is that the path of the ball cannot be predicted for very far into the future, even in classical physics. The reason for this is that even very tiny changes in the direction of the ball will result in very large changes in its motion in a very short time. So, for example, these diagrams represent computer simulations showing how the trajectory of the ball goes through a certain surface. So each point represents a measure of what the ball is doing as it passes a certain surface. Actually, this is done in what is called phase space. The interesting point is that these points just move at random across this diagram.
You're not talking strange attractors, right?
Yeah, strange attractors are there. in general, it's this whole subject of deterministic chaos. One observes that the trajectory becomes as unpredictable as a completely random process. So, there are many interesting examples of this. One example that is quite interesting is turbulence. This is just a computer simulation of turbulent flow of a fluid. This also has this property of deterministic chaos, which means that even though it's a classical system, you cannot predict what's going to happen for very far into the future. So, it turns out that this inability to predict has implications concerning the quantum theory, because in the quantum theory there is uncertainty in the physical state of affairs of about the order of magnitude of a number called Planck's constant. This is about 10 to the 27th power in erg seconds in those particular physical units. So very tiny changes in position or momentum of the order of h can be amplified within a fairly short time to produce changes that are so large you can easily see them. And the result then is that this quantum mechanical spreading out of the system into many mutually contradictory alternatives will even occur for regular classical systems like this fluid, for example, fluid flow. This indicates, for example, that you could never really hope to predict the weather if the weather is an example of fluid flow like this, because quantum mechanical uncertainties can actually have a large effect on the weather over short periods of time. So, it's also the case that in classical examples, you can show how it is possible to add laws to the existing classical physical laws in such a way that you don't violate those laws, and at the same time, you've introduced new principles which are not predicted by those laws. This is somewhat of a strange idea if you consider the idea that classical physics is supposed to be deterministic. But this is a simple example that shows how that is possible. If you have a series of steel pins, as in a pinball, old-fashioned pinball machine, and you have one ball bouncing against them, it is possible, and we assume no friction and ideal elastic collisions and all that sort of thing, then it is possible for the classical trajectory to follow any path whatsoever that you might like. For example, you can say, let it spell out Shakespeare's plays in some particular handwriting. Well, it's possible for the classical trajectory to do that. So there's a fairly simple mathematical proof of that, though I won't go into it. But this leads to an interesting way of looking at the laws of physics. The way to, what I think is perhaps the easiest way to think of this, is to go back to this example of this simple potential that I was talking about before. This is a particular trajectory or path followed within this potential. It's just one example of such a thing. You can imagine the trajectory or path to be an object in space-time, and you can regard the laws of physics as describing the local connections between the different parts of this object. In the case of a simple trajectory like this, it's just the points as you go along the trajectory, viewed as being in space and time. So this implication of these observations concerning deterministic chaos is that if you look at the trajectory locally, in any small part of it, you'll see that it follows the classical laws of physics very closely. But if you look at it over a longer period of time, you can see that what it does is completely unpredictable. So this suggests that one can look at the laws of physics as applying to the local situation, but as not specifying what happens globally or over a longer span of time. So one can then regard the entire trajectory, say, of a physical system as a kind of continuum which can be, so to speak, flexed into any different particular configuration that you may like. I can make an analogy here to, say, taking a piece of flexible metal, like a spring. you can bend this spring into various shapes in such a way that locally it almost exactly follows the path determined by the physical properties of the tendency to resist bending and so forth, the elasticity of the spring. But yet over a long distance you can curve it so as to produce, say, some modern abstract sculpture according to your particular desire. Of course, one would say in the case of the spring, it really, no matter how you bend it, it really will bend quite a bit as you go along the length of it. Thus, it won't really be following its free desired path, which would be a straight line. But the nature of the laws of physics is such that if you view the entire space-time history of the physical system as being a kind of elastic spring, as it were, that can be bent into many different desired shapes, and still locally it almost exactly follows the laws of physics. So this leads to an approach to quantum mechanics and also classical physics, which is another alternative to these different approaches that I outlined. Essentially, what you can do, you see in quantum mechanics, the problem or the situation that arises is that the system is not determined precisely. There's certain things are determined, and certain aspects of things are determined, but there's a lot of freedom in the system. So one way of looking at it is to regard the space-time history of the physical system as a sort of flexible entity in which the laws of physics or quantum mechanics determine what happens from moment to moment fairly closely, but with some freedom. And the freedom is such that the overall pattern can be chosen more or less at will. So, yes?
Would a naive analogy be something like that, let's say, as in differential equations, only the first derivation is determined and the rest is free? I mean, I'm just trying to understand it.
Well, let us see. In terms of classical physics, the simplest way to understand it, well, I don't want to get into technical details, but there is the idea of, instead of using differential equations to describe the trajectory of the system, using the idea of finding a stationary point of the action. This action for a trajectory is a global description of the trajectory. It involves an integral of local events over the total length of the trajectory. And there's a classical principle, I guess originally developed by de Montpertis, or I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but it's similar to Fermat's principle in optics also, according to which the path of a light ray through a series of lenses can be determined by considering refraction at each lens, or you can consider the total time it takes for the light beam to go through and take that path which minimizes the time. So let's just take that light beam example. It might turn out that as you vary the path, which will minimize the time of passage, you find that you're in a very steep valley. That is, as you vary this path in this multidimensional space of all the different parameters that you can vary, varying it slightly takes you way off from the minimum. If that's true, then the path is very well defined. It's very exactly determined. But on the other hand, suppose as you vary the path, you're in a very broad valley in this multidimensional space that's almost flat. In that case, it could be that you could have many different paths which were almost equally good. So the main implication of these findings in deterministic chaos and so on is that in many physical systems it is like that. The valley, so to speak, in this multidimensional space determining what is the proper path is so flat that all kinds of different paths are possible. And quantum mechanics makes this situation even more the case. It actually, you can say, it makes the valley even flatter. So we can then think of this idea of the total space-time history of the physical system as being very freely adjustable. And yet, the laws of physics are locally obeyed. So if you do experiments, you'll always see that the laws of physics work out as you would expect. So to go back to this idea of Elsasser, this is a specific way of introducing his concept of the creative selection. The idea here is that you can take this space-time continuum and, so to speak, working on it from a vantage point that is transcendental to time. That is, you're taking the whole history at once and molding it. And you can get it to produce all kinds of different forms. For example, structures of organisms, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, this whole bending and flexing procedure produces a pattern that's completely consistent with the laws of physics. So this is a possible model which can be applied to Elsasser's idea. And I would like now to go back to this concept of consciousness that I mentioned before. I'll mention in particular an interesting experiment in parapsychology, which has been reported in recent years. This is the original work was done by a man named Helmut Schmidt, a physicist. He had a radioactive source which controlled a random number generator and determined whether, he had a circle of lights, and only one light would be on. And the light that was on could either shift to the right or the left with a 50-50 chance depending on the radioactive decay. So when you looked at it, you'd see a light that would sort of be randomly moving around in a circle back and forth. Now, according to quantum physics, with a 50-50 chance, this light should just do a random walk. So all the statistical properties of random walk should be there. But he then would ask a person to look at this light and try to will it to go around clockwise. And he found that at least with some subjects, over a period of, say, an hour or so, they could consistently make it tend to go around clockwise. It's not that they could just make it march directly in a clockwise direction. It would keep going back and forth. But on the average, it would keep going around clockwise. So, also, there were some people in which they wanted it to go clockwise, but on the average, it would go around counterclockwise. Things seem to be happening in a perverse fashion for them. So, this experiment is interesting. This is an example of a parapsychological experiment involving psychokinesis. And, of course, that's a whole subject to go into. All the different parameters that you can vary. Varying it slightly takes you way off from the minimum. If that's true, then the path is very well defined. It's very exactly determined. But on the other hand, suppose as you vary the path, you're in a very broad valley in this multidimensional space. It's almost flat. In that case, it could be that you could have many different paths which were almost equally good. So the main implication of these findings in deterministic chaos and so on is that in many physical systems it is like that. The valley, so to speak, in this multidimensional space determining what is the proper path is so flat that all kinds of different paths are possible. And quantum mechanics makes this situation even more the case. It actually, you can say it makes the valley even flatter. So we can then think of this idea of the total space-time history of the physical system as being very freely adjustable. And yet, the laws of physics are locally obeyed. So if you do experiments, you'll always see that the laws of physics work out as you would expect. So to go back to this idea of Elsasser, this is a specific way of introducing his concept of the creative selection. The idea here is that you can take this space-time continuum and, so to speak, working on it from a vantage point that is transcendental to time. That is, you're taking the whole history at once and molding it. And you can get it to produce all kinds of different forms. For example, structures of organisms, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, this whole bending and flexing procedure produces a pattern that's completely consistent with the laws of physics. So this is a a possible model which can be applied to Elsasser's idea. And I would like now to go back to this concept of consciousness that I mentioned before. I'll mention in particular an interesting experiment in parapsychology, which has been reported in recent years. This is the original work was done by a man named Helmut Schmidt, a physicist. He had a radioactive source which controlled a random number generator and determined he had a circle of lights, and only one light would be on, and the light that was on could either shift to the right or the left with a 50-50 chance depending on the radioactive decay. So when you looked at it, you'd see a light that would sort of be randomly moving around in a circle back and forth. Now, according to quantum physics, with a 50-50 chance, this light should just do a random walk. So all the statistical properties of random walk should be there. But he then would ask a person to look at this light and try to will it to go around clockwise. And he found that at least with some subjects, over a period of, say, an hour or so, they could consistently make it tend to go around clockwise. It's not that they could just make it march directly in a clockwise direction. It would keep going back and forth. But on the average, it would keep going around clockwise. So, also, there were some people in which they wanted it to go clockwise, but on the average, it would go around counterclockwise. Things seem to be happening in a perverse fashion for them. So, this experiment is interesting. This is an example of a parapsychological experiment involving psychokinesis. And, of course, that's a whole subject to go into. But the interesting thing here is, you can ask, what is it that's being influenced that makes the light tend to go around clockwise, if indeed all this is correct, and it's really doing so? It would seem that the person is not changing what's going on within the arrangement of lights, nor is he changing what's going on in the circuitry that directly controls the lights. It would seem that the change must occur at the level of the decay of the atoms. In fact, Schmidt checked this by monitoring some other stages of the equipment and so forth. So then you can ask, well, how could the subject who was willing the light to go clockwise possibly know what the atoms were doing, or how the decay of an atom in a particular way would influence the random number generator so as to make the light go in the desired direction? Because the subject who was willing the light to move around, of course, was not aware of how the whole apparatus was built. And in fact, it is possible to make the apparatus quite complex in such a way that even if you knew how it was built and you were able to control the decay of the atoms, still it would be hard to do so as to get the desired result. So what seems to be involved here is that we have events occurring in such a way that they anticipate the will of an individual. And this seems to involve a violation of causality. That is, because the individual is willing something to happen at a given time, at an earlier time, something that he doesn't even know about is happening so as to enable that desired thing to happen. So this seems to be a quite paradoxical state of affairs. It turns out, though, that this particular way of looking at physics is quite compatible with this kind of event. Let us just imagine, for the sake of argument, once again, the space-time history of events as a kind of flexible continuum. And let us imagine that the will of an individual could have some influence as to what state that continuum was in at a particular time, so that the continuum could be drawn to go through that state. Well, if locally the laws of physics must be satisfied, and the continuum can be somehow made by will to go through that particular state of affairs, representing, say, clockwise motion of the light, then it follows that everything has to line up in the time preceding that state of affairs in such a way that at each stage the laws of physics are satisfied. And that then follows necessarily that the atoms are forced to decay in such a way as to ultimately produce that result. In other words, if we look at the laws of physics in this way, we find that this kind of anticipation of the future, or apparently teleological behavior of physical systems, is quite compatible with the theoretical structure. So I wanted to conclude by observing that this particular model, which one can tentatively think about, this is just a model being proposed for thoughtful consideration. This particular model is also consistent with some of the ideas in the Vedic literature concerning the nature of the relationship between consciousness and matter. So, briefly, in the Vedic literature there is the concept that essentially there are two kinds of conscious entity. The individualized conscious beings, such as ourselves. The term jivatma in Sanskrit is used to refer to these entities. And also there is a superconsciousness, which is simultaneously conscious of all phenomena and is directly in control of all phenomena. And it is described in Vedic literature that this superconsciousness, or Paramatma, relates with the material realm in a manner that transcends time and space. Essentially, on the level of the superconsciousness, or the level of Paramatma, there is no difference between past, present, and future. And also, all places, all spatial locations, are simultaneously observed. The idea is that this one superconsciousness perceives the entire space-time picture at once and can control that through the exertion of its will. And the Vedic literature also describes the nature of the relationship between the individual conscious entity and this superconsciousness as being one in which a conscious entity associated with a particular body is not directly able to govern the actions of that body. This, for example, is described in the Bhagavad Gita, that the individual soul is not the performer of actions within the material world. But the idea is that the link between the individual conscious entity and the material energy goes through the superconsciousness. That is, the supersoul is aware of the desires of the individual entity, and the supersoul controls the material energy in correspondence with those desires. But not, of course, exactly in correspondence with them, because different conscious entities may have incompatible desires. A rich man may desire that his wealth will not be stolen, and a thief may desire to steal it. So then one of them won't get his way. So the idea then is, in the Vedic literature, that the supersoul, acting in a global fashion, determines the sequence of events within nature in such a way as to optimally satisfy various desires and so forth of individual conscious entities. So this is also a very complex topic, but one can see how that would fit into this picture that I am describing. We can look in particular at this parapsychological experiment. In this case, if the subject of the experiment, who is looking at this arrangement of lights, is desiring the lights to go around in a certain way, then, according to this model, the supersoul can adjust the space-time picture in such a way that that happens. And that also involves events which anticipate the movement of the light. Actually, this Schmidt performed an even more disconcerting experiment. He had the random number generator produce a tape about a week before the person was to look at the lights. Then, instead of running the lights with the random number generator, he used the tape to run it. Instead of using the radioactive source to run the lights, he used the tape to run them. And he again got positive results. The person could will the light to go around clockwise, but yet the specific sequence of ones and zeros, which determined what the light would do, had been recorded a week before. So,
Who's plugging into who?
huh?
Who's plugging into what and who? That's the question then.
Who is whatting?
Who's plugging into what and who?
Yeah.
Is the man plugging into the pattern that's already been set by the computer, or is the computer adjusting to the man plugging?
You can ask, well, could it be that because the pattern came out the way it did the week before, therefore the person decides to will to make it go a certain way? Of course, one problem with that is that you wouldn't expect the pattern to go around consistently in a certain way. You'd expect it to do a genuine random walk, in which on the average it wouldn't go around in any particular way. So it becomes, and then even if you suppose that the person later willed something because of what happened earlier, the question is, what is the connection that caused him to do that? So these experiments involve many problems of interpretation. But the observation that I thought was interesting was that this general model of the relation between consciousness and matter is consistent with that. And of course, another feature of this model is that this model enables you to preserve the laws of physics, but it still allows a superconscious being to control in considerable detail the course of events. So, let's see. Well, I've spoken for about an hour. I'll stop here. Are there any questions or comments? Yeah?
So I noticed that you didn't really mention the similar observations and research by Richard Copper and Bateson about the holographic paradigm, where they're also trying to establish kind of models where they're observing that at a certain point matter is no longer matter, but the pattern is there, but the matter is no longer there. Richard Copper calls that the dance without the dance, where there's the dance, but there's no longer a dancer. And therefore matter can, at that level, be directly influenced by the way the observer is observing matter, which seems to be the point where matter or the universe is being created by mind, and they are very much into agreement on that level of physics that is something there that needs to be taken into account at lower levels as well if you want to escape the paradoxes that appear in the time-space continuum. But when you go beyond that, the paradoxes are no longer there.
Yeah. Well, this...
Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with the writing of David Bohm in particular.
Right.
Bohm has introduced some ideas along these lines, and actually one starting off point for me in considering this was Bohm's idea, some of Bohm's examples of his implicate order, because in a way you might say that what I'm presenting here is a concrete version of what Bohm is saying, with I think a couple of additional features. Because one interesting question is, if you have the implicate order in which things are very much mixed in with one another in his idea, giving rise to an explicate order which corresponds to the realm of reality as we observe it, then there's the question of how the implicate order gets determined to be in just the right way so as to produce this kind of explicate order. This is sort of like the problem of initial conditions. Consider, for example, this bouncing ball that I had before. That was this one. It's indeed a fact that you can choose the initial angle of the ball so that the ball spells out Shakespeare's plays. That means that in the number representing that angle, all of Shakespeare's plays are present. That's sort of like this implicate situation. It's also very much like a hologram. In a hologram, in one little piece, an entire picture is present. Similarly, in this one little number, you have all of Shakespeare's plays stored up. But you can ask, well, how is it that it would come to be that this angle is just right so as to give you Shakespeare's plays? You need really good aim for that. But the approach here is that if from a global perspective you can say, okay, let's determine this to be Shakespeare's plays, then it follows that the angle will come out right. So possibly this is a contribution to those ideas, in that it explains how some of these initial conditions, which I think are entailed in Bohm's system, can turn out to be so precisely specified, so as to give rise to so many different phenomena.
Does that mean, is that the difference between did God make one act of creation, or is there a continuous process of creation that keeps adjusting?
Well, the scheme that we have here is one which you can look at either from the point of view of progressing through time or from a global point of view that transcends time. According to the Vedic literature, the platform on which the Supersoul actually operates is global and transcends time. But then you can project that down into the level in which time is passing from moment to moment. According to that scheme, from looking at it from the point of view of time passing from moment to moment, you should actually see events which act in such a way that something can happen later. And it might be very hard to see how they got aimed just right, how the initial conditions were selected properly. But from a global perspective, then it makes sense as to how that could happen. At least that's one insight that I think perhaps can be gathered from this model.
But we would have to abandon the limitation of speed of light, propagation, changes, etc.
No, it turns out that this particular model, this way of looking at it, is consistent with the theory of relativity, which is interesting, because what it says is that causal signal propagation within space and time can only go at the speed of light. But you can have transcausal signal propagation, if you like. That is, according to this scheme, it is possible for the space-time continuum to be bent or molded in such a way that you actually have correlations set up between 2 points such that a beam of light couldn't travel from one to the other. That is, they're outside of one another's light cone as far as relativity goes. But that does not violate the theory of relativity, because transmission within space and time is still limited to the speed of light. It's also interesting that this point of view avoids some of the causality paradoxes that you seem to get into when dealing with things like tachyons and other hypothetical particles, which by traveling faster than the speed of light can go backwards in time, and so forth. Yeah?
I will just ask you, a few years ago, I think 1980, there was a rather thick paper published by, I guess his name was Jan. He's a dean of aeronautic engineering at Princeton University.
Yeah.
It was published in, I would say, super conservative IEEE proceedings.
Yeah.
It dealt with his experiments in parapsychology, right?
Yes.
Do you recall it? I never read any reaction to it, but it was quite interesting. Somebody of that high position who earned many international awards, etc.
Yeah.
They so seriously busy with that subject, but I never heard any reaction.
Well, I went and visited his department there at Princeton. I didn't have the opportunity to speak with him personally. I spoke with another professor who was working there. They have a laboratory in the basement called Laboratory for the Study of Engineering Anomalies. That's how they term their research into parapsychology. So they're doing extensive research into things like psychokinesis, and they say they've obtained very good results. They're using computers and making statistical studies and so on and so forth. They've apparently corroborated the kind of experiments performed by Helmut Schmidt, for example. So, and other investigators have also corroborated these things. Of course, many scientists, shy away from this kind of subject matter, although I think an increasing number are beginning to take an interest in it.
I guess that last case you mentioned about that tachyons, what do you call it? Tachyons propagation.
Yeah.
Crossing the time barrier.
Yeah, the idea.
I read recently in Physics Today, also a super conservative journal, that the Undersecretary of U.S. Defense Department was making kind of suggestion for communication with submarine if this kind of scheme, I guess, via tachyons could be made possible. Anyhow, few numbers back. Although I just recall this small piece of paper on quantum mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
I just mentioning, maybe it's interesting for you. I'm not specialist in that area.
Yeah.
The last question about this statistical evidence for parapsychological phenomena. Many years ago, there was a book written by a certain George Spencer Brown, apparently a British genius, and we have it somewhere out here down in the basement. And he has tried to show that actually these deviations from the expected probability distributions, they are not that much due to the external influence, but that there is something fundamentally wrong with statistics. I read it many years ago, of course I didn't understand it, only rather partially, and there was at that time, some 25 years ago, discussion between statisticians about it, and I don't know how it finished. I'm just asking you whether you are familiar with it. That's at least George Spencer Brown is the author of
Laws of Form.
Laws of Form. That's the, I would say, strange Boolean calculus, right?
Yeah, I looked at that book, although I must say I never studied it in any depth. I'm not really familiar with his arguments concerning validity of statistics.
Well, I'm just mentioning for you, maybe it's interesting for you. I don't recall the title, but we have it somewhere lost in the basement. Mm-hmm. This book.
Yeah.
I had it in hand maybe 12 years ago.
Yeah. Of course, there's much controversy in all of these different areas. But so, looking further.
Well, in fact, I did not understand where the extra flexibility comes from. I had the impression that you mixed up the laws of quantum mechanics, say the equation of Schrödinger, and the laws of classical mechanics, say the Hamiltonian equations. If you consider the Hamiltonian equations, then the path of a particle is completely fixed by its initial position. Yes, it is completely fixed for all times.
Yeah.
I had the impression that you added a small fluctuation, say at t equals 0, and the small fluctuation has a quantum mechanical origin. That's right.
We can look at it in this way. Yes, as you say, in the classical system, if you specify the initial conditions, the entire trajectory is completely fixed from that point onward. But the point is, then, that exceedingly small changes in the initial condition can affect the trajectory in a very drastic way. So much so that it can become completely different just based on a very minute change. In fact, the change postulated in the initial conditions can be so small that it's on the level of quantum mechanical fluctuations. Now, this is a sort of loose way of going from classical to quantum mechanics. To do the thing properly, one has to analyze the Schrödinger equation and so forth. I didn't try to go into any of that. Actually, the most appropriate way to approach the quantum mechanical aspect of this problem is to use the Feynman path integral approach. The reason for that is that the best way to analyze classical physics in this context is to use the action minimization principle. And the Feynman path integral is the quantum mechanical analog of that. So if you then go to the Feynman path integral, that's the way to approach things. But in this discussion, in a sort of loose way, I went from classical to quantum mechanics, simply by the idea that if you have a fluctuation of quantum mechanical magnitude, that is around h or thereabouts, being amplified in a fairly short time to produce a really big effect, then one would expect that if you actually solve the Schrödinger equation for the system, you would find that the wave function in a very short time would spread out to encompass many alternatives. For example, in this bouncing ball case, where by slightly changing the initial angle, the path will be radically different. So one path will spell out Shakespeare's plays, let's say, and of course most paths will just be chaotic and go all over the place. So this would suggest that if you really solve the Schrödinger equation for that case, then the wave function describing the path would very quickly spread out so much as to represent all these different paths. In fact, mathematically you can show that.
Well, of course, in a sense, also quantum mechanics is the mechanistic. Once you describe the initial condition psi, it's also fixed.
Psi is fixed.
Psi is fixed.
Right. Psi is fixed, but psi encompasses many alternatives, such as live and dead cats.
Yes, that's true. But then of course comes the theory of measurement into play. That is
right, and then there are different approaches. So one approach that has been taken is to say, very well, psi spreads out, so we won't stick with one psi. At a certain point, we'll collapse the wave function. We eliminate all the alternatives but one, and then that's the new psi. And then that spreads, and then we have to do it again, and again collapse the wave function. Now this leads to problems in interpretation. For example, some persons, such as Eugene Wigner, will say that conscious perception of the observer causes the collapse of the wave function. Other physicists don't like that at all, and there are many different proposals that have been made. One of these even is that, well, let's not collapse the wave function, and let psi as a whole represent reality, and then you have the multiple universes scheme, in which there's one universe in which this conversation is going on, and another one in which we're doing different things, and another one in which we don't even exist, and so on. So all these are attempts to solve the problem of measurement in quantum mechanics. If you like, you could say the thing that I'm presenting here is another one, another approach, which has, I think, some interesting features. Yeah?
You were mentioning that at one precise angle you get all the works of Shakespeare, and then when you go off that angle you get chaos. I don't know whether I have to object to that, in the sense that it would seem to me that if one angle produces all the works of Shakespeare, at that moment you determine it to be Shakespeare because you recognize that it is Shakespeare. That would seem to me that whatever angle would produce its own path very precisely and very much repeatable. So it means that every pattern would be as complex as the works of Shakespeare, simply that you don't have the vantage point to actually recognize the complexity of its pattern.
That brings up a very interesting question, because if it does produce the works of Shakespeare, then we will say that it's produced a meaningful statement.
Right.
But let's say it produces something else. Could there be some kind of intelligent being to whom that would be a meaningful statement? Could it be that for every possible complicated zigzagging path, there exists some intelligent being for whom that is a meaningful statement?
well, belongs to some author who's produced work comparable to Shakespeare.
Right. In other words,
recognizable by someone else.
Yeah. Is there a language such that if you knew that language, then you could read it, and it would be the works of that author? To our own worlds, somewhat along the same lines, but quite alien, in which you have octopuses, as in the science fiction stories, talking with each other and so on, or worlds that we don't even know how to think about because they would be so alien. So all these possibilities are there. So then what selects this world?
Vantage point rather than angle.
Well, vantage point is included within the world, of course, because it's one thing to just look at the balls and have an outside observer who's going to read this as Shakespeare. But now, if we look at a larger picture which includes the observer, and we start out with some initial conditions which result in observers observing certain things, then the vantage point is also within the observed system. So how many different arrangements of the initial conditions would produce systems in which you have observers who will say that I observe such and such?
Yeah, but I thought in epistemology you stop at a certain level, and then you stop after the level, you're watching the watcher watching the watched, right? Mm-hmm. You watch the watcher that's watching an object. After that, it makes more sense to go exponentially. So it seems to me you're describing basically you have the individual. The vantage point is watching the pattern that's being created by a certain angle, and after that it's Paramatma that's doing watching or the influence.
Well, yeah, and of course that's the basic scheme I'm proposing.
Yeah.
That's the basic idea.
But the point is, as individual consciousness, can you get to the level of Paramatma? Can you get to the state where you are watching the watcher and the watched?
Well, can we get to it? Paramatma is at it already.
I know.
Can we get to it? So that, of course, is a fundamental question. According to my understanding of the Vedic literature, the individual consciousness remains individualized. The consciousness of Paramatma is always the universal consciousness. And the individual consciousness, inasmuch as it is an individual consciousness, is individual. If you say, by some means it can become on the level of Paramatma, then you've got Paramatma and the individual isn't there anymore. In other words, in one sense, logically, the individual has been annihilated and now you've just got Paramatma, which you had all the time anyway. So the question then comes, does the individual exist eternally, or can the individual cease to exist at a certain point? And that's a topic for discussion in the Vedic philosophy. For example, my understanding of the Bhagavad Gita is that it would postulate individualized consciousness as being eternally coexistent with the consciousness of the Paramatma, so that the ultimate stage of realization of the individual is realization of relationship with the Paramatma. And according to this concept, ultimate oneness means ultimate agreement or harmony with the will of the Supreme, not becoming identical with the Supreme, since that would actually, in a sense, be equivalent to annihilation, because it would mean then the individual is no longer in the picture and the Supreme is the only thing that's there. So that, of course, is a whole subject to discuss.
What you're essentially saying is that the theory of creative selection is a way to look at quantum and quantum mechanics such that they can be in no contradiction with the Vedic philosophy. Is that correct? What I've understood from your...
Yes. Yeah, you could say that that's more or less what I'm synthesizing here or putting together. In other words, and I don't propose this particular way of looking at quantum mechanics as being the last word or anything like that, but just as an interesting exploratory attempt, the idea here is that one can take the laws of quantum mechanics and interpret them in such a way as to be consistent with the idea that there is a supreme intelligence controlling all phenomena. This, of course, is relevant to some very long-standing questions in theology, for example. When Newtonian physics first came on the scene, the old idea of divine providence, according to which God is in control of the motion of every blade of grass and so on, seemed to become now inconsistent with physics, because it seemed that the laws of classical physics are completely deterministic. So then if God had any role in actually determining what happens, that role had to be exercised at the beginning. God could set everything in motion, and then according to the laws of physics, it could all work out. So according to this way of looking at the quantum theory, it's possible to have the laws of physics as observed by physicists and so forth, but it's also possible to have God in control of everything. So that's more or less the main idea of this.
But then my question is, if I rightly understood, and I think you tell me that I did, it's important for theology, for it takes away the quantum physical theory as a possible contradiction of a holistic theory of consciousness and the universe. The question is there an influence the other way around? Therefore, if you look at physics, the Newtonian physics, at a certain time, where a theory which was not the last word in physics, and then afterwards came the quantum theories, which were a refinement of the old Hamiltonian principles, gave a new view on the physical phenomenon, on which the old theory was a sort of classical limit.
Yeah.
But what I'm interested in is the theory. Do you think the theory of creative selection has a influence back on such that, say, the quantum mechanics is some sort of, not classical, but pseudo-classical limit of a larger theory of selection?
I think so. And this example from parapsychology is an example of specific predictions of this theoretical framework, which one would not make, I think, if one was thinking simply in terms of quantum mechanics as it's normally presented. In other words, in these parapsychological experiments, which are sort of at the threshold of scientific acceptance, you might say,
yes, that's not wrong.
They're just sort of hovering on the threshold and have been for some time. One problem with them is that it's hard to come up with a theoretical system that makes sense out of a lot of these things. And it would help greatly in the analysis of the data and so on if you had such a system, at least a tentative one. So what I'm proposing is that the scheme that I'm talking about here at least makes sense out of some of these parapsychological phenomena. Not all of them, I think, by any means. But at least some of the phenomena in parapsychology in which you seem to have causality violations, which are very hard to understand from the point of view of normal physics, can be understood from this framework. So this may provide a way of theoretically understanding the parapsychological data and thus guide further investigation and thus lead to fruitful developments in the area of physics and paraphysics then. So this is also a possible outcome of this.
That's the point where I'm in difficulties. There is a serious discussion about delay. Is the interpretation of these parapsychological experiments is that really correct? Statistically correct?
Yeah. Well, obviously, indeed, that's a very great field of discussion. And certainly quite a number of people seem to feel that the data is worth taking seriously. The general objection to parapsychological physics is, well, it's just statistical, it's sort of on the boundary line. Maybe it's due to some systematic experimental error, experimental bias, or something, even cheating or whatever it may be. But at the same time, a lot of experiments have been done with quite a bit of rigor. For example, this Dean John at Princeton has done quite a few experiments, which he has analyzed quite carefully. And it seems that something is really happening with these experiments. So, of course, one just has to look at all the data and all the analysis to come to a conclusion about this, but I have the impression that something is actually happening in this area.
About consciousness,
only makes clear that within the view of that theory, those parapsychological experiments could be true, but it does not say that they are true.
Well, nothing ever says that anything is true. In fact, all we can do with theories in physics is corroborate some data. We never prove that anything is true. We just develop greater faith in a certain thing because it seems to work consistently. So, even in physics, there's a leap of faith.
Yes, certainly.
So, yeah?
It seems to me with those parapsychological results that you mentioned, that all you can really prove or substantiate is that there is some mind control over some matter, because you're disrupting the hazard kind of what do you call it,
random or
the randomness. You're disrupting the randomness.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you say you can put on a tape and the person gets connected up to the tape, so a person that's pushing the button, he can connect up to someone else's mind who is influencing him. He can connect up to some kind of information storage that he is connected up with. Because if the psyche can connect up to anything, it depends on whose psyche and what information is. That's why I said before, who's influencing what and who.
Mm-hmm.
So it's no longer important to find out who is influencing who and what. It's simply that there is a phenomena of the randomness that is being disrupted, and then it's immaterial who is doing it. Because
well, perhaps it's not immaterial. In other words, yes, certainly you can say that one description of what's going on here is that the randomness is being disrupted. One point of view would be to say it's immaterial who's doing it, but maybe if you ask who's doing it, you can get an answer to that question. In other words, one problem in science is that of prematurely saying that certain kinds of questions are unanswerable. That was an objection, for example, that many people raised to Bohr's interpretation of quantum physics. Because what Bohr did in the early days of quantum physics was say, okay, we've gone this far, now to go any further, to make any further distinctions and ask any further questions, you're talking about something that's unaskable or unanswerable. But then some other scientists said, well, no, that's not necessarily true. For example, Bohm came along with a hidden variable theory which would produce all the results of quantum mechanics. And so he said, actually Bohr was wrong to stop us from inquiring further and say that such things would be fruitless, because maybe my hidden variable theory is right. So it might be a bit premature to say we can't say who's influencing the randomness. Perhaps it's reasonable to say that the person who wants the light to go around is really influencing it. So one should at least consider that also. And one thing that, as I was saying, that this way of looking at things does is it explains how it can be that a simple action of will could produce the desired effect. Let me explain what I mean there. Another way of explaining the desired effect is to say that it's somehow a very complicated action of will. For example, suppose the person could reach back into the past somehow and adjust the atoms so that the light went around. Or suppose there was a third being who was adjusting the atoms back then so that the light would go around, and also somehow adjusting the individual so that he would then will the light to go around. That's pretty complicated. But the scheme I have simply allows the individual to say, okay, I want the light to go around, and then everything falls into place according to this principle of the local agreement with the laws of physics. So one can bring in principle of parsimony or Occam's razor and all that kind of thing. Of course, that doesn't prove anything, but it's also a factor to consider. Yeah?
By the way, did anybody repeat these experiments by Helmut Schmidt?
Yes, I am.
It must be very trivial. I mean, even a year we could set up within 1 week here.
I think you could. I understand that people have done so. This Dean John, I believe, has also. You could try it too.
But then still is a question why in our Western university culture, at a certain moment in history, so many persons get the life going right is essentially any different from your little ball going all over writings of Shakespeare.
Well, if the ball actually did write Shakespeare's plays, you'd be pretty amazed that it did that and would want an explanation.
Yeah, so we are pretty amazed that so many persons can get the life go right.
Right. So how does one explain that?
But this raises the point of any parapsychological experiment. This is the reproducibility. In physics you make one experiment and everybody can repeat it at any time you want.
Right.
With this phenomenon you don't have it. So the problem is either we do not know exactly what is the mechanism. That's why if we use the wrong parameters, we won't have this experiment, this result. Because as you mentioned, this was the yield. You had on one slide you had the yield as a function of two parameters. And you said only under certain conditions you will have maximum and you have some effect. So maybe you can use this as an explanation for the non-reproducibility of parapsychological experiments. That's what was my question also.
Well, yes. Certainly in parapsychological experiments, one is dealing with the mind, and the mind is certainly very complex. In physics, those experiments where things are nicely reproducible generally involve what we regard as being pretty simple systems. So one interesting feature of these parapsychological experiments is somebody will will the light to go around clockwise, and actually it'll go around counterclockwise, as though some psychological blocking or something was taking place. So we're dealing with very complex phenomena here. It's more like psychology, where things are not always so reproducible either.
And splitting up in experiments where you say one person is an experiment is of course like two. It's just looking as a small part of the trajectory of that little ball going through the pinholes.
Yeah, there's the experimenter effect also.
Yeah.
The experimenter also wants something to happen. His will is involved, and so forth. All kinds of complicated things are going on. Yes?
In Buddhist philosophy, it's spoken about interdependent arising. And if you see that philosophy, you even cannot talk anymore about an individual, because the individual and the actions of the mind of the individual is always dependent of all the different factors which are spraying with. So if there is the machine of the parapsychology and the individual, there's always the interrelations between it.
Yes, and this model has that kind of feature actually, because as I was describing the way this is being related to the Vedic philosophy here, is that this superconsciousness or Paramatma is dealing with the whole thing at once in accordance with individual desires, and there may be various individuals involved. So that means a balancing out of different desires and so forth must take place, just like the example of the rich man who wants to keep his money and the thief who wants to steal it. So inevitably not everybody can get their way, and it has to balance out somehow. And also in the beginning of the lecture, by the way, I mentioned this point about consciousness being connected with matter in a non-local way, and I was going to get back to that. So here we see consciousness being connected with matter in a very non-local way, and the particular way that shows up in these parapsychological phenomena is we have a non-locality going across time. Whereas the point of the little analysis that I went through in the very beginning of the lecture was to show that even if we want to somehow associate consciousness as something real with a brain, with nerve impulses going on and so forth, then we need some kind of non-locality according to space, because the elements of our conscious awareness, feelings, perceptions, and so on, don't correspond directly to nerve impulses, but they can only correspond to groups or patterns of nerve impulses on an abstract level. So that means you need a spatial non-locality. So that's being generalized here to a larger kind of non-locality also. Yeah?
Perhaps a naive remark, but I see a certain analogy, let's say, what's happening in an analog computer, which we call also computer, but it's totally different kind of computer than the usually used digital examples. In an analog computer, we have also electrons running through the wire, and we can't say that the total behavior of the analog computer is somehow directly related to the behavioral patterns of individual electrons. And we are perfectly satisfied with the situation.
Yes.
Isn't it a
and we can
analogy? I don't know.
Well, the computer example that you give there.
Analog computer.
Pardon me?
Analog computer.
Analog.
Like analog.
I'm stressing it because digital computer is, in my viewpoint at least, something totally different.
Yeah. Analog or digital, what is going on is not necessarily in a one-to-one relationship with the result you want to get out. And of course, in talking about computers, we don't normally bring in consciousness. That is, there's no need to do so in talking about computers. You can go through the whole analysis without even thinking of that idea of consciousness. But if you were going to attribute a consciousness to a computer, what would you assign it to within the computer? That's the question. What going on in there would you assign the consciousness to? Well, it would somehow have to be the overall pattern of what was going on. But then that means you have a sort of non-locality. So
I think what you also should consider is that in physics usually you have very simple systems, two bodies bouncing against each other, for instance. And in biology, and if you keep with life, to talk with life about life systems, you have very complicated and complex systems. And it seems perhaps that in these complex systems you have there's some kind of a violation of the think of the laws of physics. I think that's the difference. Because I am always concerned with reproducibility. We have to have that, of course. But these are simple systems which are isolated from its surroundings. And what you mentioned, or Eva mentioned, that if you take the body, the observer, and the system, and the whole of its interactions with the whole world, you have a complex system. And then perhaps reproducibility may not go the way we are used to it. If you think of a computer, digital computer, if you are used to it, you know also that sometimes you get crazy about the computer because you do exactly the same things, the same programming, and then it gives you a signal, you have done wrong, this or that. And you never find out, and then the rule is try something else, and you try something, and the result comes off. This is not a logic way of doing it, but computer experts do it. I think you also have done it, isn't it? So
yeah.
I mean, this is to state that if you have complex systems, sometimes you are going to believe in a moon effect or something like that. You can't explain it. Because you could, if you could penetrate this complex system, a big IBM computer, no one is able to penetrate. So there's some analogy to the phenomenon you describe in parapsychology and in another complex system, technical one, a computer, and the human system, with the whole surrounding. So perhaps some clue is in there.
Well, of course, one good point to make in connection with what you're saying is that in this model I presented, we keep the laws of physics intact. However, we don't really know that complex phenomena follow any particular set of laws of physics. For example, nobody really knows what's happening in the brain. You could have laws governing some of the events there that are quite different from the accepted laws of physics. That's also quite possible. So one should also be open to that also. Because, in fact, probably that is, in fact, the case. That's another whole discussion to go into.
Because this leads me to my second question. I have still even, well, what your model, your theory, it doesn't violate physics, and I'm happy with that, and it explains certain phenomena that you say the boundary conditions or initial conditions may change slightly, you have the uncertainty phenomenon and so on. That sounds fine, but I have still another problem with the parapsychological experiments. This is the poltergeist and this kind of phenomena, because here you don't have to talk about statistics and about average values. You're familiar with the word poltergeist?
Yes.
Where you have telekinesis with heavy objects, like 70 pounds or a whole man being lifted up or a table, whatever it is.
Right.
And here there is not an apparent violation of the laws of physics, but there is a violation of the laws of physics in our eyes. And
Yep.
we can't explain it.
Indeed.
Here I have the trouble. There must be some interaction of the supermind or super or Paramatma, you call it, with material things. And then I ask, well, there must be some, if we talk in physics, some coupling between these two matters. Is there some extra kind of heat we have to introduce? Well, here I'm lost.
Well, of course, here you would definitely have to add something quite new to the laws of physics. Certainly that's required for these poltergeist effects and many other far-out type phenomena that are observed. For example, in poltergeist cases, they observe what they call apports, in which a piece of matter disappears from one place and appears in another, and it doesn't seem to cross the space in between. And indeed, you really need to do something with the existing laws of physics to cope with things like that. So, the particular model I've been talking about here doesn't address that problem. You would need, you can speak of introducing additional kinds of fields, but even that may not be enough. You may have to introduce a new kind of topology of space, for example, to get things to go from A to B without crossing the space in between. Some new topological constructs may have to be introduced, and so many different ideas might have to be contemplated. And I suspect there's the field is wide open for understanding such things. Yeah?
Isn't it true that the general model that you outlined elegantly explains all such phenomena, namely that Paramatma has the power to indeed alter such objects?
Well, of course, in the most general sense, the model that we're talking about, in which Paramatma is controlling the material energy, allows for all kinds of effects. What we're specifically discussing here, though, is the idea that events tend to follow consistent laws, as we all see in day-to-day life, and at the same time there is some interaction between consciousness and matter. And from a perspective of spiritual philosophy and so on, there's the idea of superconsciousness and its relationship with matter and so on. So the question is, how do those things fit together? So the idea was to just give certain insights into how that can be. But there's also the possibility of a whole hierarchy of different kinds of laws and principles acting within nature, which we have hardly even begun to study yet. We speak of the laws of physics, but of course, looking at physics historically, you can see the laws of physics change every few years, sometimes quite drastically. And there's no reason to think that that's going to stop either. So there can be all kinds of different laws and physical principles.